Getting bigger by being better. The number one choice for Bristol. This is BCFM 93.2.
Well, now we turn to what should be, we mentioned the whole idea of international law, didn't we? The idea of war criminals going to jail, people like Tony Blair, people like George Bush, alleged war criminals, facing trial, having to answer questions. Well, this week I spoke to an International Criminal Court lawyer from The Hague who said he believes that they might rather poison defendants to death rather than allow them to be acquitted. He also explains who really runs the court. His name's Christopher Black and he's Canadian.
That's a very good question, but it means there are two sets of tribunals. There are the ad hoc UN tribunals like the Yugoslavia and Rwanda tribunals in Sierra Leone, which were under UN auspices but really controlled by the Americans and other Western intelligence agencies. And then there's the International Criminal Court, which only has jurisdiction back to 2003. And it only has jurisdiction for those countries which are members of the Rome Treaty. The United States signed on but then withdrew. Russia and China are not members of the treaty. Syria is not. Afghanistan is not. Although Afghanistan has now given permission to the ICC to do investigations.
But 2003 was the year of the illegal Iraq invasion. Surely that's right within the jurisdiction. Why haven't we seen Bush and Blair hauled before the courts?
Well, you can ask the prosecutors for the ICC that question, which we've asked, and they won't give you an answer. And it's quite clear that although the United States is not a member of the Rome Treaty and is not a member of that court, it controls, the EU and the United States control the staffing of that court, and they control key members of the staff in that court, and they really approve the judges, and the prosecutor is appointed by the Americans, no matter that they're not involved in it, technically speaking. The present prosecutor, Fatima Bensouda, was a former prosecutor of the Rwanda Tribunal and spent her career covering up U.S. war crimes in Africa. So they control the mechanisms of these tribunals, so there's no way that they can be charged, even if you could assume some sort of jurisdiction.
Well, this is worrying, isn't it? I mean, I was in Holland recently and speaking to just an average guy who was running a fish shop in the Hook of Holland, and he was saying how my father, who's still alive, his father lived through the war, and he said the thing my father always says is that the people in charge in The Hague now were on the wrong side during World War II. You've been involved, I know, at The Hague. You haven't given up, like many of us might, but you've been involved in both the Rwanda and the Yugoslavia cases. Can you just take us through those?
Well, I got involved first at the Rwanda Tribunal. My involvement came this way, briefly. When NATO attacked Yugoslavia, I was very angry about that in Toronto. We had big protests here against that. Massive protests. So I looked around for some other lawyers. What can we do as lawyers to try and do something against NATO? And there was a group here led by Michael Mandel, as professor at a law school here, who wrote the famous book, How America Gets Away with Murder. He led our team, and we filed war crimes charges against NATO at the Yugoslav Tribunal in The Hague. Because at that time, the prosecutor was Louise Arbour, who was one time my professor of criminal law and was a colleague of these other guys. Anyway, she turned us down, froze us out, and acted really as a policewoman for NATO and charged Milosevic just at the time when the French and the Germans wanted to stop the attack and conclude some sort of peace deal. So she arranged with Madeleine Albright and Bill Clinton an indictment against Milosevic, so he became a quote-unquote war criminal and therefore could not be negotiated with, and the war continued. So that allowed the war to continue and justified the war in their propaganda. All the charges against Milosevic were absolutely false. And it turned out he proved that during the trial. I got involved in 2000. I was asked by the American Association of Jurists to go to Belgrade to do an investigation onto his arrest, whether it was a political arrest or not. And I found out that it was, in my opinion. They let me speak to the new pro-NATO, pro-fascist government they had installed there after the war. And their Minister of Justice told me to my face that the charges against Milosevic were false, but they had to arrest him because the Americans demanded it, and if they did not, they were going to be bombed again. And then he was shanghaied and taken to The Hague in an RAF plane, and framed up with false charges, and he spent the rest of his life defending himself against those charges till he died in his prison cell under mysterious circumstances. At the same time, I got asked to defend a Rwandan general who was the head of the national police in Rwanda. And if you accept the standard narrative in the media about Rwanda, you compare the government there to the Nazis, he would be Himmler, the head of the Gestapo. But he was acquitted of about 60 counts of genocide. And if you ask yourself, how could a man be acquitted of 60 counts of genocide who ran a national police force? Well, then you have to ask, was any of that narrative true? Because it wasn't. In fact, it was another, same as Yugoslavia. The Americans backed a proxy force like they're doing in Syria to attack a semi-socialist government, overthrow it, blame the government for war crimes, justify the installation of their puppet regime and keep it there since. And it's still under a dictatorship of Paul Kagame, who's murdered millions in the Congo since. That's how the system works. And I was lucky enough, or maybe unlucky enough, depending how you look at it, to get involved in those cases. And it's taken up the last 15 years of my life. And what I've learned about what goes on in the international criminal justice system is enough to disgust even the most optimistic person, because the people that say they're trying to control war crimes and stop war, in fact, the ones who are committing them, they're the ones who commit the war crimes, they're the ones who find scapegoats, and they're the ones who spend their lives covering up their crimes and blaming others for them.
What do you make of the media coverage? Surely some of the things will have come out, like, for example, the mysterious death of Milosevic in custody. Well, most people look at that and think, well, surely he was poisoned in his jail cell.
Right. Well, I think he was, personally. We don't have definite concrete proof of that, but there is a report. The only report done on his death was done by the NATO tribunal itself, the ICTY. It's called the Parker Report, because there's a judge involved named Parker. And even in that report, which is very pro-NATO and tries to wash their hands of any responsibility, they indicate that there were 2 drugs in his body which should not have been there and can't be explained. It may have had a role in his death. One was a narcotic, and one was a drug which expedites the deterioration of other drugs in the body. They accelerate the breakdown of chemicals in the body. And he wrote a letter 3 days before he died to the Russian embassy saying he was being poisoned. But he died before the letter could be acted upon. So I'm convinced he was poisoned. And the reason why is because he had won the case. He demolished the false charges against him. So they had one of 3 choices: let him acquit him and let him go back into politics, which would be a major blow to NATO and would totally prove to the world there was no justification for the war against Yugoslavia, and he would be a major force again, or falsely convict him, which would raise lots of questions because there's no evidence to convict him, or they kill him. They eliminate him, and that's what happened. They couldn't let him go, and they couldn't convict him, so he died.
So could you just go through briefly what the sort of charges were against him and how they fell apart?
Well, they first arrested him in Belgrade on corruption charges, claiming he's stashed away billions. I was told by the investigating judge on that case that it was all false. He had nothing. He had no money. At The Hague, they charged him. The indictment changed over time. It was initially for some alleged massacres in Kosovo that his forces were alleged to have been involved in. That fell apart. And then they charged him with vague conspiracy charges of conspiring to create a greater Serbia, as if that's a war crime. It may be a political, issue, but they alleged that's a war crime. In fact, it wasn't true in any event. But he demolished all these charges, and he had lots of support from very high people testifying on his behalf. And all the charges, like Jeffrey Nice, the British prosecutor, was lying pretty much every day in the court there. He said the Kosovo field speech in which he alleged Milosevic said he was pro-Serbian nationalist speech was actually a speech in favor of eclecticism and ethnic diversity. It's the exact opposite of what Jeffrey Nice said it was when you listen to it. So the whole case fell apart. There was nothing against it. They were just fake charges to justify the bombing.
Well, as you know, Tony, I used to be an aid worker in Yugoslavia during that era, and I listened with interest to Christopher Black's analysis of what happened. What I would say about the International Criminal Court is that The United States has always insisted that it won't be part of the International Criminal Court because they have no intention whatsoever of their people ever being accused of war crimes. So in other words,
interesting then that they're appointing the judges.
Oh yeah. So in other words, the International Criminal Court is basically a kangaroo court, which will basically go after people the West doesn't like, and that's about it. And of course, the others conclude that there's not much point participating in it. I think the Russians have withdrawn from it for exactly the same reason, because if the Americans don't want to be part of it because they don't want to risk their people being sent, the Americans, let's be clear, they're not prepared to recognise any supranational jurisdiction over their nationals, and in that case there's not much point having international institutions at all.
What about the UN Security Council?
Well, the UN Security Council, has different members on it, and they've got different attitudes. Most of some of them are members of the International Criminal Court, Britain, France, and Germany, and some of them aren't.
It seems like Milosevic's big crime was to be running an independent country.
Well, the point is, he was a political operator in Yugoslavia with a lot of other political operators. And if you're going to criminalise people for doing politics, then you're going to find it really difficult to resolve any political situations, aren't you?
Isn't it simple that Yugoslavia was a massive travesty by NATO? Really, the sort of crime that we've seen. The worst regimes in history, like the Nazis, just totally taking on a country and destroying it and breaking it up for their own purposes.
Well, let's face it, it was a very complex situation because you've got a number of different republics there with a number of different politics and so on. But of course, outside forces, particularly the Western imperialist powers, were determined to destroy independent socialist Yugoslavia, and by God, they succeeded.
Anyway, I think one of the things we'll definitely do, I had it ready for this week, but no time for it, is a real look at the East India Company and their role in the past in creating and fomenting wars, particularly after the revelations last week of these death squads in Yemen, run by private companies, funded by the Pentagon. But anyway, time to sign off for the Murdoch News at 8 now. Coming up live on Facebook, it's Arabian Nights with Mohammed Makawi. Thanks to our guests in the first hour, former Bradley Stoke councillor, now UKIP National Executive Ben Walker, also former squatter Rick Carey. Thanks also to Old Labour Oxford economist Martin Summers. You'll find this show's podcast, story links, comment page and our contact details at thisweek.org.uk. I'm on Twitter at Tony Gosling. Here's wishing you a relaxing and enjoyable BCFM weekend. Do please join us for the Politics Show at 6 o'clock next week. God bless, and don't let the banksters get you down. I'll leave you with a song from the Cookie Crew from 1991.